It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here with all of you today, and especially to have Dave Kittredge with us. That's just a thrill. I, along with David Kittredge and David Foster at the Harvard Forest, as well as several other people here today, am a co-founder of ALPINE, Academics for Land Protection in New England. ALPINE, which is a collaborative initiative managed by the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, the Highstead Foundation, and the Harvard Forest, is an outgrowth of the Wildlands and Woodlands Project, about which you will hear more today. Before I start, I want to welcome several dignitaries in our audience. I'm looking right at former Congressman John Olver, who is with us here today and after whom this building is named. We have Secretary Katie Theoharides, who is the new Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs. We have her Undersecretary, Dan Seeger. We have Vice Chancellor Steve Goodwin here. I believe we have Vice Chancellor Mike Malone here. And we have several distinguished alumni of the environmental conservation programs at UMass Amherst. These include Gary Clayton, who is the president of the Massachusetts Audubon Society, Jane Diffley, who is the just very recently retired president of the Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests. We have Lee Youngblood, who is the CEO of Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust. We have Keith Ross, who almost single-handedly achieved the largest conservation easement in the history of the United States. I believe we have Sarah Wells here, who also works at Mount Grace, and there are many other alumni here, but let me ask you to recognize that the University of Massachusetts Amherst has graduated a disproportionate number of very accomplished conservation leaders in New England, and for that we are most appreciative. I also would be remiss if I didn't thank the staff who has worked literally for 9 months to make sure that we had this occasion today. Mary Ann Jorgensen is somewhere in the crowd, right over there. Robin Austin. Chandni Navalka. And I want to pay special thanks. Most of the speakers I won't introduce right now, but I want to pay special thanks to Kurt Griffin, who is professor and head of the Department of Environmental Conservation. Kurt really did the groundwork at UMass to make this happen, so Kurt, thank you very much for that. So I have a book here, a periodical called Paperbark. I picked this up in Steve Goodwin's office. Paperbark is the student publication focused on sustainability at UMass Amherst. I leafed through this literary magazine, essentially, and I found many things I liked, but this page I liked the most, which says, "Our roots are still alive. Indeed, they are." The first instruction on conservation offered at the school that we know of, that was focused on conservation, was given by a Mr. Emerson. But this Mr. Emerson was George Burrell Emerson. He was Ralph Waldo's cousin, and he came to the Massachusetts Agricultural College in 1870 to lecture on the importance of trees, forests, and their conservation. George Burrell Emerson was famous in his own right in his day. He was a champion of women's education, a distinguished natural scientist, the first president of the Boston Society of Natural History, and a lover of trees. Mr. Emerson was the author of the groundbreaking volume published in 1846 with the very exciting title, A Report on the Trees and Shrubs growing naturally in Massachusetts. We have no record of what Mr. Emerson said when he visited the Massachusetts Agricultural College, which is the precursor of Mass Audubon, but we can guess that it was something like this, which he wrote in his 1846 book. The new settler clears in a year more acres than he can cultivate in 10, and destroys in a single burning many a winter's fuel which would be better kept in reserve for his grandchildren. This profuse waste is checked, but it has not entirely ceased. It is, however, giving way to better views. A wiser economy shows itself. May it be universal. The health and growth of the trees of any one family are subjects worthy of deliberate and mature and long continued attention of any man, and may I say today, woman, of whatever intelligence and with whatever resources of science. Mr. Emerson said this almost exactly 150 years ago. This is an ethic that is very much alive today in Paul Catanzaro's classroom, in the Keystone Project that David Kittredge nurtured here at UMass, and in the very building in which we sit, the John W. Alver Design Building, which I believe is, and I quote, the largest and most technologically advanced academic contemporary wood structure in the United States. I mentioned to you earlier that it's my honor to welcome all of you here today. It is my further honor to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Katie Theoharides. Katie serves at present as the Massachusetts Secretary of the Executive Office of Energy and Environmental Affairs, which is especially appropriate because she occupies the same office that was first occupied by Charles H.W. Foster, Hank Foster, who was the first Secretary of EOEEA in the 1970s. Hank was also the first paid executive director of the Nature Conservancy, the dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School, and an exceptional mentor to several of us in this room today, myself included. The awards that we will be presenting today are named in Hank's memory, and Katie is a very worthy successor to Hank's legacy. She has a long and impressive resume, including publications, more than a decade as a consultant and public servant focused on climate change and conservation. But perhaps even more significant for us is the following. Katie knows the woods and the fields of central and western Massachusetts particularly well. She went to high school 25 miles from here in Wilbraham. She worked for several local land conservation organizations, including the Hilltown Land Trust and the Trustees of Reservations. She has degrees from Dartmouth College and the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Katie is now known nationally as a leader in the effort to address climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, Secretary Theoharides.
Thank you, Jim, for the very kind introduction, and thank you so much to you and David Foster for the invitation to be here today. It is an absolute honor and a real privilege. I can't tell you how the geeky grad student ecologist in me is just thrilled to spend the afternoon with all of you on a Friday who I've really considered rock stars for most of my career, and so it's just such a pleasure to be here. I also wanted to thank the folks at UMass who have put this together and for all of your leadership on this issue of land conservation and forest ecology and bringing science to bear on the decisions people are making on the landscape, on the way forward to keep rural economies going, and on how to bring people to this equation of land conservation and working lands. And so I'd really like to offer my congratulations from the governor on this award. I also couldn't think of a better space to be doing this ceremony in with a cross-laminated timber and the idea of storing carbon in our buildings, which is something that we're very excited about at the Executive Office. I didn't have the opportunity to meet Hank Foster ever, but I did do a little bit of reading about him before coming today, and I think one of the things that really stood out to me was the way he brought science and his understanding of ecology out to people, and recognized that land conservation is something that only works with all of the people who have a stake in it at the table, working together to bring a project to fruition, and to think about the concept of a network of connected lands providing important services to people across a region like New England. And so I could not think of a better person to name this award in honor of, and I could think of not a more apt example than UMass Amherst as a place that really focuses on bringing science and the application of that science to the spirit of land conservation and to making that a success. And to David Kittredge, I think he is the exemplar of that effort, of bringing all of the knowledge that sits at this university, that sits the network with Harvard Forest and in the Wildlands and Woodlands Consortium, to actual on-the-ground decisions in terms of foresters, in terms of land conservation. David, and this David as well, were both formative in my own career in this field. I was lucky enough to be an REU student at Harvard Forest after my freshman year of college, and worked with David Orwig as well. Well, worked for David Orwig. He was my advisor as an REU student, also with Spencer Meyer, who's over here. So lots of familiar faces. But I remember David Kittredge giving a seminar one evening for the REU students, and he was actually talking about man-made hurricanes and tornadoes, forest disturbances that were required in New England based on the current conditions of forests. And for me, that was a new concept, the idea that we have such a imprint on our forests, and that forests here in New England have had such a long legacy of human development and human use on the landscape that they actually need to be managed in a more proactive way in many cases, was I think a new thing for many of the students who were in the room, who I think had come to this with sort of a feeling that forests were wilderness and forests might be okay if we just left them untouched. And so I still have this memory of the debate that followed after this discussion of man-made disturbances at Harvard Forest that evening. I wanted to talk a little bit about how this work on bringing science to informing the protection of the landscape and climate change really fits in with all of the work we're doing at the state level to address these challenges. And so one of the things we've been so fortunate to have is the access to universities across the Commonwealth, I think especially UMass Amherst and the UMass system, and certainly Harvard Forest, where we can pull the research right into the policies we're setting and the planning work we're doing. A great example of this has been our work through our Municipal Vulnerability Preparedness Program to help cities and towns begin to adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we were able to partner with the Northeast Climate Science Center right here at UMass to get the data and science we needed to deploy that to communities, often with the help of graduate students at UMass or other places across the Commonwealth. And in 2.5 years, we've now had 70% of our communities who are addressing climate change and looking at land conservation in the context both of carbon sequestration, but also the resiliency value that's offered on these landscapes. And so a big piece of this for me is as climate change gains more traction and people are worried about the life and safety impacts of climate change, how can we make sure that forest conservation and open space conservation continues to be part of that discussion. And we are certainly looking to the forests, to the trees, to our wetlands in terms of their carbon sequestration value as well. And for the first time, looking at an inventory of land-based emissions and starting to work that into the math we do every year in terms of tracking our emissions and making sure we're making smart, sustainable decisions on the landscape and using the wealth we have to hit our climate goals. The other piece I'd note, and something that's a little bit less tied to this conversation, but something I'd love to talk with you all more about, is the increasing work we're doing on the transportation front, which also, again, ties in a lot to land use, but we are now working across the entire Northeast and New England region on setting up a cap and trade program for transportation vehicle emissions. And I think this is important because it will help us make some of these harder to make land use pattern and development choices that we really need to make as we start to curb carbon pollution from the transportation sector. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I will close by saying just again how important the work you're all doing is and how important that you're all bringing people into the conversation. I was at a 468-acre parcel celebration of a new wildlife management area that the Division of Fisheries and Wildlife and the Department of Fish and Game now holds out in Templeton this past week. And you know, it was up on top of a hill, an open field, abutting forest land, and there was a beautiful view over to Wachusett Mountain. And the leaves, of course, are right at their peak. And I think what was even more inspiring than the view on that hilltop and the knowledge that that parcel will be saved for wildlife habitat and recreation in perpetuity was the people that were gathered. So there were academics, there were state agency folks, there were plenty of sportsmen and folks who love getting outside and enjoying the land, and there were residents of the Templeton community who were there and scientists as well. This was a parcel of land that folks had been looking at for years as a piece that would join together a tract of about 2,600 acres. And you know, I think that really, for me, encapsulated what this is all about. It's bringing people together to protect special places and to address our environmental challenges. So congratulations to David on this honor, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here.
So, at this moment, we're going to watch a little film that encapsulates the day just a little bit. I want to introduce to you Maggie Janik, who is the film editor and without whom absolutely this film would not exist. Maggie is a graduate of Rhode Island College and has a master's degree from the Harvard Extension School. So Maggie, turn on the film and we'll take it away. An exemplar among land-grant institutions of higher education in New England. The University of Massachusetts Amherst has a long history of examining and working to improve humankind's interaction with the land. UMass Amherst was founded in 1863, enabled by a land grant under the Morrill Act signed by President Abraham Lincoln. This is just a year before Lincoln, with another piece of land grant legislation, established Yosemite, creating the precursor to the first national park in the world, a model which has been replicated on 6 continents around the globe. From the start, the UMass curriculum was focused on farming, natural science, technical courses, and the liberal arts. As it expanded rapidly after World War II, UMass Amherst's expertise in planning and landscape design became both well-known and highly respected. Several key UMass conservation-related initiatives have had profound influences on the map and our management of the landscape for more than 3 decades. For example, in the mid-1980s, the university's Center for Rural Massachusetts, in partnership with the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, published the precursor to Rural by Design, a planning classic that continues to inspire generations of town planners today. In 1986, Gordon Abbott, former head of the Trustees of Reservations and Associate Director of the Center for Rural Massachusetts, co-authored with Charles Foster a strategy for land conservation in New England, a seminal conservation vision also published by the Lincoln Institute, also highly relevant today. And in 1988, Professor and Extension Forester David Kittredge helped to create one of the first coverts programs in the United States. In the Commonwealth, that program is now known as the Keystone Program. It has trained hundreds of key players across the Commonwealth to make forest sustainability and conservation a high priority among local decision makers. Keystone collaborators have direct control over more than 20,000 acres and are involved through land trusts, conservation commissions, and sportsmen's clubs with more than 175,000 acres. The Keystone Project is now being replicated across the nation. Professor Kittredge was also a lead author of the landmark 2005 Harvard Forest Report entitled Wildlands and Woodlands, A Vision for the Forests of Massachusetts. While working to pull that report together, he was an early champion of woodland councils, now known as regional conservation partnerships, which today spread across New England. Today, UMass Amherst students, faculty, staff, and alumni are enhancing the university's role as an exemplar in the field of conservation in many ways, including the university's collaboration with some 40 other New England colleges and universities in ALPINE, Academics for Land Protection in New England, a critically important endeavor in this age of climate change.
UMass has a very long history of natural resources management. Back in the late 19th century, the Mass Aggie is when we started first having the first college lectures in forestry in the country. And then in 1930, the department of what we now call the Department of Environmental Conservation was formed.
I found UMass actually through a friend who had gone through the environmental conservation program here. She spoke to me about what it's like to be a student here, and it totally lined up with what I wanted to be doing and what I think is really important work moving forward.
I think in part UMass Amherst, because of its location within Western Massachusetts, within Massachusetts in general, within Southern New England, sits in this really interesting crossroads of phenomenal forests, phenomenal ecology, yet we see all of the development pressures. We have a long and storied history in Massachusetts of land conservation, so I think there's an ethic here. I think people across the country look to Massachusetts for innovation, for ideas. It's a natural sort of stew of characteristics that really poise us very well in the intersection of land conservation and forests and other natural resources.
As I was looking at and thinking about graduate school opportunities, UMass Amherst was one of the schools that I was seriously considering, and they also offered me a research assistantship in a marine fisheries biology program. I decided to accept that opportunity, and it proved to be a great academic experience.
I went to UMass for 3 years while working part-time at Mount Grace. And what was great about that is the flexibility at the university without walls, and the courses that I had outlined for myself, I could modify those.
Much of our research is applied. We're very passionate about contributing to land conservation and sustainability. But also we have a very strong commitment in the built environment and sustainable building design and energy systems as well.
The University of Massachusetts has really been focused on sustainability for a significant period of time, and a lot of it has come from the students themselves. So what we've tried to do here is we've tried to give students the opportunity to live sustainability.
UMass has a lot of really hardworking and empowered students that do take on a lot of initiatives.
It's amazing to have those kinds of individuals, these young people, working with us. We all learn from that process and that experience as well. It helps change us in a very, very positive way as an organization. We learn from them, which is wonderful.
The heart of the UMass land conservation effort is the faculty, individuals such as David Kittredge, who transmit the university's culture of conservation from decade to decade.
I found a kindred spirit in Dave Kittredge. I knew that we had done programs together. He's such a bright, creative guy.
We first met Dave Kittredge at a Keystone project. We were debating at that point whether or not we were going to conserve the land. I remember going over to him during the break with my map and saying, "This is what we're thinking about, and I don't know what to do." And he did me the honor of listening, understanding, and saying, "I'll come and walk on your land." He listened to what we wanted, to what we cared about, and helped us develop it that way.
I was first motivated to do conservation by encountering landowners that were selling their land for development because they didn't know they could sell their land for conservation. It's very poignant when you meet a landowner who's so dedicated to keeping their land the way it is, and it's partly because, in many cases, they've fallen in love with it.
There is a lot of land conservation work that's being done in Massachusetts, but I think we could do a better job of involving people whose voices might not be represented in the conservation community. And I think that would just enrich and empower everything that conservationists do.
I would like to see myself in 10 years making an impact in the community that I am surrounded in.
Today, UMass Amherst serves as an exceptional public institution advancing land protection and stewardship. The cumulative impact of the university's conservation-related programs is evident in the talent and enthusiasm of its students in pursuing careers in land conservation, the creativity of the university's faculty in developing a pioneering land conservation curriculum, the courage of the university's leaders in promoting comprehensive, campus-wide sustainability, the outstanding record of UMass alumni in protecting landscapes throughout the Commonwealth, across New England and beyond, and the remarkable effectiveness of the university's extension and outreach programs in enabling the growth of a deeply rooted culture of conservation at the community and regional level.
As proud as I am of the past UMass has had in influencing land conservation, I'm more excited about the future. Our ability to incorporate land protection into the formal academic setting, to have classes, to connect students with land trusts so they can learn what land trusts do, to incorporate that knowledge, that land conservation literacy into their own professions, no matter what they may be. I think our best impact is yet to come.
We're getting towards awarding some plaques, but first we have comments from George McCarthy, the president and CEO of the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy, who has been instrumental in providing me and Shawnee and Robin and Marianne an opportunity to work on this project with all of these colleagues from UMass and Harvard. Mac.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for coming out today and giving me the opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. I think this is quite an honor for us as well as for the University of Massachusetts and all of us to really recognize decades of accomplishment here in Western Massachusetts. One of the things that I think is really important to underscore here is that Massachusetts has been at the epicenter of land conservation for centuries. And a lot of what we're learning in our efforts to conserve land in Massachusetts have been extended to far reaches of the world through the efforts of people like Jim Levitt and the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy that I represent, and many other kind of networks and of thousands and thousands of people working to really do extraordinary things. And I think that's something that we should all be really proud that Massachusetts was such a, had such a founding kind of influence on conservation globally. Just to give you a little bit of kind of that history, now Jim and I might argue about whether or not it's the first publicly or privately conserved land in the United States. But Boston Common was founded when the members of the Massachusetts Bay Colony decided to tax themselves to buy a piece of land that was going to be conserved in perpetuity as green space in Boston in 1634, 14 years after the Pilgrims landed. Quite extraordinary. And then we've heard already about the trustees of the reservations, which was actually the first land trust in the world, and it was chartered in 1891 in Boston. The Land Trust Alliance, 90 years later, was formed over a bunch of discussions that were held at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And that went from conserving something in the order of 50,000 acres of land at the time to really expanding and taking to scale land conservation, private land conservation in the United States, so today that we have more than 56 million acres of privately conserved land in the United States. And as Jim likes to point out, it's a land area equivalent to about the size of the state of Minnesota, right? And you know, one of the things to keep in mind is that Land Trust Alliance, which has been a model of network building and really taking a great idea to scale in the United States and Canada as well, has now been put on a global platform through the International Land Conservation Network, which is also headed up by Jim and is housed at the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. I don't know, at last count, I think it was 28 countries. You have active land trust networks now trying to conserve land at scale in all those places, and that's something that's really important, and I think important for a variety of reasons. Lincoln is also kind of the proud home of ALPINE, and you all know about ALPINE because you're here. But it's certainly a way that we kind of bridge kind of the conservation community, the academic community, and policymakers to really try to make a difference in a region, and it makes a big difference in a region as important as New England. So in Massachusetts and the work of UMass, ALPINE, and hundreds of other partners, this land conservation is adding up to other big things. And one of the things that we pride ourselves at Lincoln is in getting people to understand the fundamental role that land and land policy plays in helping us to achieve other kind of higher level goals. And some of these higher level goals might be something as kind of mundane as preserving human life on the planet. And some of them might be a little bit, more kind of relevant, especially I just came from Cape Cod. Armando and I drove up, and we were in the midst of a 2.5-day long nor'easter with winds and waves pounding, and luckily it comes at a time of celestial lower tides, because if it didn't, we would be seeing really significant erosion. But preparing for climate change, sea level rise, the severity of storms, the frequency of storms, being able to both mitigate and to adapt to the effects of climate change. Land, of course, plays a fundamental role there, whether it's building the green infrastructure that's going to protect our cities, or whether it's sequestering carbon through the land and the trees that we preserve or we use to build extraordinary buildings like this building here. So for us, the land, unlocks a lot of things, and land policy for us is also kind of a hinge that will allow us to do many, many other things, including things like the conservation of land, to do things like preserve habitats for endangered species, or just for the enjoyment of us, so we can get out there in the woods and really enjoy nature as it was meant to be enjoyed. So it's with great pleasure and great pride that I come to you and thank you and ALPINE and UMass for all the extraordinary work you do. And I just want you to know that the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy remains committed to this work for as long as we're in existence, and hopefully, like the land trusts around us, will be in existence in perpetuity. So thanks again, and I look forward to the rest of the show.
I want to call to the podium David Foster. Almost everyone in this room knows David. David has had an extraordinary career, both academically, where he's run the Harvard Forest for 30 years and had a list of publications so long it would take you an evening to read it. He's also the prime mover in getting wildlands and woodlands as a concept embedded deeply in policy and in the culture of Massachusetts. So, David, I turn the podium to you.
Jim, thanks very much. Katie, thank you so very much for coming out and being part of this great event. We're here today to celebrate both a great institution and a great person. And the backdrop to all of this really does start in 2005, I guess, with the publication of the Wildlands and Woodlands report, but it goes back much further than that because all of us were trained in our science and educated in conservation by great institutions, great faculty, great nonprofit organizations and state agencies and the people who lead them. The Wildlands and Woodlands effort, the initiative, came out of academia, but it lives through collaborations and through partnerships. When we put that vision for the future of Massachusetts and then New England together, we did it with an understanding that the existing capacity for land conservation across New England was unsurpassed in the world, as we've heard, with this long history and this great construction of small to large private organizations, public agencies, from municipalities up to a federal government that supports this. And so we knew it would be completely unnecessary and pretentious to suggest to create anything different. But instead, what we hoped to do as a group of academics was to use our backgrounds to articulate a possible future that we thought we could all achieve, and then to use all of our creativity and knowledge and resources and our institutional resources to try to contribute to that great effort that was being advanced by the private and public sector. And as that generated some conversation, we forged an alliance with what has become, well, we forged an alliance first with a small nonprofit that was led by Charles Henry Foster. And it was called the New England Natural Resources Center, and I like to describe it as a shoebox that Henry had in his bookshelf, which represented the legal documents for his nonprofit, which he would pull out of his bookshelf whenever there was an important cause to advance. And so when we put together Wildlands and Woodlands, put that out as a report, we basically conceived of that as actually as a white paper that we'd throw up into the air and we'd see where those sheets of paper would go. We happened to forge an alliance with somebody who's a great science to policy communicator who suggested to us that distributing white sheets of paper across the landscape would not be very effective. And so we produced a report, and then the response that came from the public and private sector was, well, okay, there's aspects of this that we like. How are you going to do it? Well, we had never actually thought about that, but we realized that we needed to form partnerships with those people who were asking the question and with other organizations that would support us. And so the second nonprofit organization that stepped up and essentially took the trajectory out of the hands of Henry Foster and his center was the Highstead Foundation, which, like the idea, was looking for something to champion, and like us, was looking not to create a new entity that would go out and conserve land, but to occupy those niches that weren't currently filled by public and private activity. What places that we could put the limited resources of the Harvard Forest, Highstead, and then our growing set of partners like the Lincoln Institute, the New England Forestry Foundation, and all to bear where it could hopefully make a difference in terms of advancing this activity. Along the way, the University of Massachusetts and Dave Kittredge became absolutely critical in this. In fact, Dave and Brian Donahue from Brandeis were absolutely instrumental, along with Glenn Motzkin, who I'm seeing in the back there, who was at the Harvard Forest at that point, in writing that first report and coming up with that, what I think is a compelling argument that we need both the completely wild and the very heavily managed. And by bringing those together and then recognizing that the landscape is filled with people and other enterprises like agriculture and other natural resource activity, that we could produce something that was balanced, was bold, and would serve both nature and people. So that collaboration has been critical of academics and others. And then within that, we recognize that we as academics had been inspired in our own careers by lots of things that happens in academia. The students that write those phenomenal senior theses, like Elisa Golodet, who wrote what was a paper that led to the formation of the North Quabbin Regional Landscape Partnership, the inspiration for what Dave Kittredge calls woodland councils and we've come to call regional conservation partnerships. We're inspired by faculty who served on local boards like Dave Kittredge does in the Shutesbury Planning Board, or who would conserve their own land or forge an alliance with a neighborhood group to conserve a broader landscape. We were inspired by a few academic institutions that stepped up and actually conserved their own land. So we thought that there was some possible power in academia that could be brought to bear on this issue of land conservation and add to the wildlands and woodlands momentum. And out of that came ALPINE, Academics for Land Protection in New England, the idea being that if we gathered together groups of students and faculty and administrators, that we could learn from each other, we could inspire others, we could produce tools that could be taken and applied by interested individuals or institutions all across New England and beyond. And this morning we saw two phenomenal examples of that. We saw a wonderful module in land protection produced by Paul Catanzaro, which was in response to one of our first ALPINE meetings where it was recognized that there are a lot of people who teach environmental science or policy or law or history who might want to talk about an important phenomenon that's going on in the landscape that students are interested in and might want to learn more about and take into their own lives, which is the conservation of our landscape. We also heard Jacob Freeman from Middlebury College, who's produced a wonderful toolkit to help students at colleges generate societies or clubs or groups that can advance conservation in their local landscapes. So ALPINE is taking off as a collaboration, Wildlands and Woodlands is taking off as a collaboration, and out of that came an interest in recognizing and honoring institutions and individuals at those institutions who are real leaders and exemplars of what both Wildlands and Woodlands is hoping to achieve and ALPINE represents. And so today we have two awards to give out. The first one goes to the institution, the University of Massachusetts, and the only thing I would add to what we've already heard about the departments and the faculty and the ethic at the school is to elaborate on the incredible role that comes out of associated programs. We've heard a little bit of Keystone, But there's a wonderful program called the Family Forest Research Center, which Paul Catanzaro is the co-director of, which is this wonderful joint program from the U.S. Forest Service and the University of Massachusetts that does fundamental research on the people who own 40% of the United States and more than 60% of New England, which are private individuals and families. And understanding them is critical towards achieving anything at any scale in our region. And then the Mass Woods Forest Conservation Program that has kind of come out of the efforts of Dave Kittredge and Paul, which is to actually provide landowners with information, with tools, with connections to professionals who can help them. These are just tremendous activities housed in an academic institution that are what make a difference in what happens in our landscape. And then the other thing that UMass has not been recognized for today is the over 2,000 acres of land and 5 properties that it owns, protects, stewards, and uses, and makes available to the entire population of the state and anyone who would like to go there, but that serve as centers for research, for education, for outreach, for the enjoyment that we all take in the landscape. So it's my pleasure to make the award of the C.H.W. Foster Award for Exemplary Leadership in Conservation to the University of Massachusetts. And I would like to introduce Deputy Chancellor and Chief Planning Officer Steve Goodwin, who has an undergraduate degree in zoology, was hired as a professor in the Department of Microbiology, has served as the Dean in the College of Natural Sciences, and was responsible for creating the School of Earth and Sustainability, so is very much at the heart of this marriage of sustainability and land stewardship and care that we've heard about. And since 2017, he has been the Deputy Chancellor in charge of community engagement and strategic planning. Steve. Let me just, you gotta just slow down. You can take that down. Maybe you want to hold it up.
So it's truly a pleasure to be here today with all of you. And I can say this is a very proud moment for the university. A little while back, Kurt shared with me an editorial that Jack Buckley had written about the economic impact of outdoor recreation. And as an outdoor enthusiast, I have to say, it was kind of eye-opening for me. It turns out that in Massachusetts, $16 billion in consumer spending is represented in the outdoor recreation industry. And there's $5.9 billion in wages and salaries, over 120,000 jobs. That compares with 55,000 jobs in the biotech and pharmacy industries. Right now, I know that 55 number really, really well because we're really proud of having trained a lot of that workforce for the biotech and for pharmacy, but we're equally proud of how many of those people, the 120,000 that are working in these industries that we trained here at UMass. We're extremely proud of that as well. Now, David's mentioned many of the programs that are going on here at the university. We're incredibly proud of those programs, including Keystone, which, while I was the dean, was something that I took great pride in, that it was something that came out of the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. And so I'm not going to run through all of those again, but I do want to say a little bit about the land ownership. You mentioned that we have about 21 2,100 acres of forest in Savage Hill, Mount Toby, Cadwell, Knight Sabin, and Brooks. We're proud of the job we're doing stewarding those lands. We're very proud as a university of the job that we're doing there as well. You know, the unique educational programs in land protection at UMass have been spearheaded by the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Landscape Architecture and Regional Planning. They provide a range of courses from open space planning to green corridors and a wide, diverse array of courses focused on habitat and land conservation. The Department of Geosciences also has played an important role in courses focused on indigenous communities and land protection internationally. These departments form the heart of our School of Earth and Sustainability, and the courses that they provide have had a large impact on land conservation practitioners and leaders across the country. And that's something else that the university can be very proud of. Now, Jim mentioned our alumni and we're certainly proud of them. We're so proud of them, even though I know Jim mentioned a few of them by name. I'm going to read my whole list of them here. So there's Gary Clayton, president of Mass Audubon, Anthony D'Amato, University of Vermont, Jane Diffley, president, Society for the Protection of New Hampshire Forests, Jennifer Fish, Massachusetts DCR Service Forestry Program, Bill Labesh, senior conservationist at Highstead, John O'Keefe, who I just met today, senior investigator at Harvard Forest, Julie Richburg, regional ecologist, trustee of reservation, Keith Ross, senior advisor at Landvest, Sarah Wells, Land Protection and Operations Director, Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, and Lee Youngblood, Executive Director of that same trust. Those alumni are our legacy as a university in land conservation, and we couldn't be more proud of them. So, and finally, I just want to say that I'm so pleased that you chose to honor David Kittredge today. The Keystone Project that's been mentioned over and over again is just one of the many programs and projects that's made Dave a respected researcher, a respected teacher, a respected mentor, not just in Massachusetts, but around New England and across the country and around the globe. So on behalf of the university, I want to thank ALPINE for honoring the work of Dave and all of his colleagues here at the University of Massachusetts Amherst with the Charles H.W. Foster Award for Academic Excellence in Land Conservation. Thank you for giving us this incredibly proud moment.
Well, we wouldn't do anything quite so simple as just handing out an award to Dave Kittredge. But we have a few more things to say, a few more tributes to give. And to make the introductions for that, I'm going to call Paul Catanzaro up. And I just want to say one thing, which I think you've already realized by looking at this movie. It's not that Paul is a movie star and rock star, which he obviously is, but you can just see the passion and the innate ability to convey important information effectively to students in everything that came through from that movie. And if you were at our session earlier today, you would have seen that in action. So it's very great to have Paul here to make the next few introductions.
Thank you, David. Tyler and Susie and Colin, would you mind coming up? Dave has had a very rich career with significant conservation impact. The impact can be described in a number of ways, mirroring his split research, teaching, and extension appointment. For example, his research impact can be seen in his 2016 Brandel Award given to him by the International Union of Forest Research Organizations in recognition of his outstanding contributions to the field of family forest research. Beyond research, Dave has had a tremendous impact through his teaching and extension work. More specifically, the students he trained who are out in the world having an impact themselves. Students? Nice. Excellent. As well as the community opinion leaders he reached in his capacity as the state extension forester, who are also having a profound impact on land conservation in their own communities. Of particular note, of course, is the Keystone program, which seems to be a common theme here today. For those of you not aware of the Keystone program, it's a 3-day retreat-style program that seeks to identify community opinion leaders across the state, bring them to Harvard Forest for 3 days of training, intensive training, in exchange for them going back to their own communities and being advocates of conservation. In the 30 years of Keystone, over 700 of these community opinion leaders have been trained. Keystone cooperators, any here? Right on. Anybody that's helped with Keystone, faculty, and yeah. Right on. Excellent. There have been some numbers given about Keystone, so I won't repeat the ones we've heard, but there's one in particular I want to make sure I note. So every other year, we ask Keystone cooperators to return a survey so we can document their activities and the impact. And one of the things we ask them is how many hours you've been working in the last 12 months, so in the last year. And so in our 2018, our most recent survey, the response was that they've been working for over 42,000 hours on conservation-related activity. That's more than 21 full-time equivalents, 11 of which are volunteer. So if you were to take the per hour of a volunteer time and multiply that by the 11 full-time equivalents, that's $550,000 in a 12-month period of volunteer time leveraged by Keystone. High impact results thanks to Dave's vision and the hard work of Keystone cooperators and faculty for sure. There are also impacts, evidence of the power of peers to inform these conservation decisions, which reinforces Dave's research on the power of social networks. We've asked 3 speakers today that represent Dave's teaching and outreach to provide us their thoughts on Dave and his influence on their conservation work. I'd like to start by inviting Tyler Van Fleet up. Tyler is a former graduate student of Dave's and is currently working as the Forestry Program Watershed Educator at the Watershed Ag Council in the Catskills, where she supports landowner outreach efforts and runs a suite of school-based education programs to teach teachers and students about New York City's forest-filtered water supply.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. As Paul mentioned, my name is Tyler Van Fleet. I was a graduate student of David Kittredge's in 2009 to 2011. I'm really honored to be a part of this celebration of the University of Massachusetts, and in particular of Dave's awesome contributions to New England land conservation. I'm grateful that the occasion also presents me with the opportunity to celebrate Dave's awesome contributions to my life. I've been having fun reminiscing about my happy days as Dave's graduate student in the Environmental Conservation Department at UMass. A lot of memories come to mind, like driving to and from landowner focus group sessions, talking about cool science podcasts that I had been listening to, meeting Dave at the Harvard Forest to go on walking meetings along the boardwalk through the Black Gum Swamp to discuss my research progress, and creating a new Human Dimensions of Natural Resources Conservation course together where we brought in a ton of different stakeholders, from landowners to artists, to expose students to the diversity of people invested in the land and its future. There's one sound in particular that comes to mind when I think back to my grad student days. It's the erratic tap, 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 tappity tap of Dave's hunt and peck typing emanating from his open office door. Dave's level of productivity as a researcher, a professor, an advisor is impressive by any measure. But his volume of work verges on miraculous when you consider that it was all typed up by these 2 fingers and nothing more. Dave's mentorship guided me through a fantastic graduate experience and has continued to buoy me in my personal and professional life. Today I'm the watershed educator with the Watershed Agricultural Council, where I teach teachers, students, and landowners about the critical role of healthy forests in filtering and protecting water quality in the New York City watershed. I think I can boil down Dave's essence as a mentor like this. Dave is a great teacher because Dave is a great student of the woods, a great student of our dynamic world, a great student of the natural and social systems that interact to drive patterns of stability and change unfolding around us. So what makes a great student exactly? As a former classroom teacher, I have a bit of insight into the matter. One, great students are curious. They have a genuine excitement for questioning and discovering, and an open-mindedness to interrogate assumptions. They exhibit a true delight in dismantling conventional wisdom when the evidence demands that we do so. Dave's curiosity about everything from how to more meaningfully measure land conservation progress to the goings-on of the birds and critters in his backyard instructs us to remain open and attuned to the surprising and wondrous world around us. Two, a great student has a strong work ethic. They have the drive to do the work that the problem their curiosity unearths requires, even if that means treading into new disciplines, developing new skills, and forging new partnerships. Dave started out studying trees in the woods, and over time shifted to studying the people who own and make decisions about those trees. This pivot led him into unfamiliar realms like social networks, decision-making models, taxes, and language analysis. But he did not balk. He dove right in and did the work. Finally, great students acknowledge and harness the power of human relationships to produce better work and to build a richer life. Through such endeavors as the Family Forest Research Center, peer-to-peer landowner outreach through woods forums, and even participating in his local curling club, Dave epitomizes the collaborative spirit, and his work demonstrates the advantages that come from drawing a wide circle around problems, systems, and oneself. I know I will be a lifelong student of Dave's. His example as a teacher, as a student, is a powerful one, and I am grateful that his ongoing mentorship brings such depth, fullness, and joy to my life. Thank you, Dave, and congratulations.
As you may know, 70% of Massachusetts forests are family forests owned by families and individuals. We estimate that there are more than 50,000 of these family forest owners whose decisions about the protection and stewardship of their land are shaping our landscapes and the benefits they provide. I would like to introduce one such family forest owner, Susie Feldman, to the podium. Susie and her husband Ben own land in Athol. They have not only implemented exemplary stewardship on their land, they have chosen to permanently protect it in collaboration with Mount Grace. They have also contributed to educating UMass students by being guest speakers in Dave's Human Dimensions of the Environment class, and they are both Keystone cooperators. Susie?
My husband and I own a family forest, which we're very lucky to have as a common boundary with Harvard Forest. It's a delight to have them for neighbors. Our land was bought by my parents in 1947, and I grew up there. My parents both loved everything about the forest, and as a kid, the forest made the world's best playground. There is no playground better than the forest. So, we didn't know what to do about it, and when my parents died, we decided that we wanted to conserve their memory and their passion for the forest, but we weren't quite sure about a conservation restriction yet. And then we went, as I said in the film, to a Keystone session, and David spoke, and he seemed to be an eminently approachable sort of fellow. So we had a break, and I cornered him with a cup of coffee and took him my map and had some questions to ask. He was interested enough in what I had to ask him to say, "I'll come over to your house." It was only 2 miles, but even so, he came over and he walked in our woods with us. David was the best listener to the questions we had, to the worries we had, and every answer he had was thoughtful, kind, perceptive, and gave us a whole new series of ways to look at things. So he came over a few times. Sometimes he came over bringing a guest professor to Harvard or a student, and on these walks, we'd walk around, and he enjoyed the woods. But on one walk in the fall, we're still talking about all these questions about conservation. We're walking along in the fall, and the ground is covered with pine needles and beech trees and beech leaves and maple leaves and oak leaves and everything else. And we're walking along, and David bent over and picked up one leaf that was different than every other leaf. There were millions of leaves on the ground. And he picks up one that's different. And he says, I can't remember what kind it was. "You got a who's-a-majiggy tree around here?" Oh, he points out, looks around, points it out, and showed. We were just awestruck with the knowledge and the perspicuity of this man seeing one different leaf among the millions on the ground. As we did this and rocked with him and learned to appreciate things, it validated the theory we now are very strongly holding, that you don't preserve a forest or anything by putting a fence around it. You preserve it by opening it and welcoming people to share and learn about it. And that's one great story. So, when we did a wildlife habitat cut a little later on, David's encouragement was positively crucial to us. A wildlife habitat cut, I don't know how many of you have done them, can be really horrible looking to start off with. Intense cutting, leaving the slash on the ground, it looked more like a massacre than an improvement. And I was terrified that we'd done the wrong thing. And I remember walking with David and, "Don't worry about it. I've got to cut the branches off that tree." "No, you don't. It'll be fine." And he saved my sanity through that. David, thank you very much for that support in that one. Then, at UMass, David taught a class called The Human Side of Forestry. And he used to invite us to come over. He came over and invited us a few times to come and participate by telling the students the story of our forest. We really enjoyed that because I got to see a different side of him. There were a lot of professors out there. I know there were a lot of them here too. There were a lot of professors who profess. But David was a teacher. I was a teacher for 30 years. I watched him guiding students to think about the right things, to ask the questions, and to think about rational responses to them. He was a master teacher. We loved those days, David. We had an absolute blast doing that. Okay? And at Harvard Forest, a couple more stories. At Harvard Forest, they used to do, I don't think they still do, but they called, the name of it, it was called a winter break week. When students from Harvard University, you know, the other Harvard University, the one in Boston out there, they'd have a dozen or so students come who were not forestry majors to study at Harvard for a week and study how forests work and the impact of ecological studies on all the rest of our complex world. One of the things David did on those things was a couple of times he asked us to lead these students on a hike in the woods. I'm not sure what his method was, except I think he was trying to show them the difference between a family forest and an institutional educational forest. Well, one day we were walking along with these students, and we went up to visit an old well. Our land consists of several old farmsteads. We're looking at this old well. He's supposed to be in charge of the group. All of a sudden, he gets totally distracted and goes dashing off to the side. He was excited because he found a chestnut stump, that big, this huge chestnut stump. Lo and behold, and out of the chestnut stump is growing a little pine tree. Maybe it's an analogy for life in the forest, but he was all excited about that. So, David's enormous enthusiasm for the stories that nature can tell is a very contagious disease. We caught it. It was marvelous. Thanks again for that one, David. And now, my favorite Dave Kittredge story, okay? Another of those hikes with the winter break students. It's always in January because that's when winter break is. We wandered up towards Prospect Hill Road and we stopped to look at an old cellar hole. Actually, it's the same cellar hole that the well was at, but that's all right. We went around, we looked at the cellar hole, we looked behind it, we walked behind it, and on the stone wall right behind it was the skeleton of a deer. Almost complete. It was missing one foreleg and one jaw, and only one, it had one jaw. It was missing its. The students thought we'd staged it, but it hadn't been staged. It must have been brought down by a coyote and tried to leap the wall and failed. David's thoughtful, incisive insights into life and death in the forest were absolutely amazing. Now, it happened that on this trip, my son Max had come along. And having my son there made me think, you know, my grandkids would love to see these bones. So you know what happened? David and Max picked up the skeleton. It still held together. And one of them holding the head, and the other one holding the butt end of the skeleton. They carried it all the way home, about a half a mile through the woods and the snow and the ice of New England to my barn. How many professors, how many people would do that kind of a thing out of the kindness of their heart? It was absolutely one of my most magnificent memories of David with this thing. Incidentally, what happened was we put it in our barn. We left it there all winter. It stayed as a family science project until the weather got a little warmer. And then it went out to out in the woods and little creatures ate it. So, David is an inspiring individual. Under his guidance, with his encouragement, we and our now conserved forests have embarked on a path of conservation, stewardship, and education. Every time anybody goes in those woods, they will be feeling David's influence. He will be what leads the children and everybody else that I hope to educate that way. We are honored to have learned from you, David. Thank you very much. Okay.
I'd like to introduce Colin Novick. Colin is the Executive Director of the Greater Worcester Land Trust, where he is known for his creative and innovative land protection work. Colin is the former chair of the Massachusetts Land Trust Coalition Steering Committee and is also a Keystone cooperator.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, David. In January of 1997, there was a young kid who's just out of school who was hired by a small land trust, an urban land trust with only 310 acres in 4 towns. A local forester said to that kid, "You really ought to go to this covert cooperator project." And so, in May of 1997, I got to meet David Kittredge, and he blew my mind. While I was a hiker and a camper growing up all through my life, my understanding of the landscape was fixed, both in time and in size. And suddenly, a story that was a two-dimensional black and white fixed image became a four-dimensional color swirling universe. There was a landscape that was wildly dynamic, and we had a role, whether we knew it or not, whether we acted or not. It was happening around us, and we could take a part of it if we chose. Whereas the possibility of future projects for me previously were like thin threads of trail across a fixed landscape of conserved land, all of a sudden now there was an ever-changing patchwork quilt of owners, habitats, and species. There was a story that was unfolding in the landscape, and we were all part of it. Conservation, management, and education were keys to deciding how the story would end. But it wasn't just the knowledge that David gave us, it was the passion. David is a zealot, a missionary. He proselytizes about our landscape, and as a participant, we got caught up in it. I know I did. Hallelujah, sister. Now we were brought into the effort, and we were out there telling landowners the story that was unfolding on their own land. We were telling donors, foundations, and grantors the values that were at risk and in play. We were telling the public about habitat projects, forest management, land conservation, and the story of where people lived, a story they never had heard before. So 22 years later, those original 310 acres are now 2,680, 2,373 since David. Those 4 original towns are now 10, 6 more since David. And our 1 forest stewardship plan is now 7 forest stewardship plans, with habitat cuts, invasive management projects, meadows, early successional habitats, and 2 farms, all in the mix, because of David's program. Now, because of David's program, we were also ready mentally and emotionally to grapple with being the forested ground zero for the Asian longhorn beetle's appearance in Massachusetts, for the work that would be required, and for the sacrifice that needed to be made by our community so that Massachusetts forests and New England forests could live to see another day. We were ready for the discovery of the emerald ash borer on one of our conservation restrictions within the city center. We now partner with foresters, botanists, entomologists, and habitat specialists. We work with CONCOMS, DCR, USDA, and the Forest Service. We've used SIP grants, WIP grants, USDA NRCS grants. David Kittredge was the missionary for forest land management. And through this one single participant, out of 20 from the year of 1997, thousands of acres have been set aside as conservation land. Thank you, David, for your knowledge, but most especially, thank you for your passion. That passion became my personal inspiration and bore fruit in the landscape. God bless you.
Wow, thank you so much, and Paul, thank you for your remarks and pulling that together. So as I turn to make this award, I want to tell one anecdote. The absolute greatest pleasure of being at the Harvard Forest and being the director of the Harvard Forest has been the ability to, over a long period of time, to pull together groups of people who fit the place, fit the challenge, and fit with each other. And to have enough flexibility in our operation to be able to do that in a variety of different ways. Some of those people are staff members, some of them are partners, some of them are part-time. In 1994, I had known Dave for a while, but only as a visiting faculty member who would come with classes and so on. In 1994, Dave took a sabbatical from UMass and was a Bullard Fellow at the Harvard Forest. And we had an occasion to drive into Cambridge. And on the way, I raised for him what for me was becoming a bigger and bigger problem. And that is, I could recognize, and I said to Dave, I said, you know, we at the Harvard Forest, we study a lot of things in our woods, and then regionally we try to understand the big processes that are shaping our landscape and then follow them in small areas on our forests and elsewhere. I said, we've done this comprehensive analysis of the historical role of hurricanes. We've looked at land use history and understand the wave of deforestation and reforestation, and through a lot of the great work that Glenn and other people have done, we understand the patterns that emerge and how that is constantly shaping where we're going into the future. I said, we know that there are lots of processes that are shaping our forest today, but the single greatest process that is affecting the forests across New England is one that we cannot detect at a big scale, and that is forest management. And that's because the scale of forest management in most of New England, outside of the north, is one of selection or selective cutting. And through remote sensing, I said we can't detect those patterns adequately to put them together. So here's something that we know is having a big impact, and we can't grasp it except at a very local level where we can go into a forest that's been harvested and follow it. And Dave said, well, you know, there might be a solution to that. He said when Ernie Gould was the forest economist at the Harvard Forest, he worked with a group of people to put together some legislation. It's called that led to the Forest Practices Act. And that requires everybody who does a commercial harvest in Massachusetts to file a plan. And that plan lays out what they intend to do and how much wood they intend to take out, what kind of harvest, where, and includes a map. And so it gives a pretty good idea, parcel by parcel by parcel, of what has happened. I knew about the Forest Practices Act. I had no idea about this, and I said, well, Dave, where does that sit? And he said, oh, it sits in file cabinets. And so we went, and Dave was right. There were file cabinets filled with all of these plans and individual parcel maps showing areas that were cut and how much was taken out. And by God, Dave and I put together a plan to hire a group of summer students and then hire somebody who worked at the Harvard Forest to digitize every single one of those plans, enter all the associated data, and produce for the first time a comprehensive understanding of this diffuse but incredibly important process. So that led to a lot of further discussions with Dave, because I realized that he bridged worlds and had access to information that was absolutely critical to us, ranging from that kind of state agency data to what private landowners were thinking and doing. And so we talked to him, and I learned something absolutely extraordinary, which was he was the extension forester for the state of Massachusetts, but he only had a 9-month appointment, and he wasn't paid to work in the summer. Now that was extraordinary to me, and so I recognized an opportunity. And so for an incredibly small investment, we were able to hire Dave Kittredge. And we talked about it, and he decided that in part to honor Ernie Gould, who both of us admired intensely that he would take on the title of Forest Policy Analyst at the Harvard Forest. And so from that point on, we had an incredible asset, an incredible new staff member who has contributed to every research program and every outreach effort that touches on forests in Massachusetts and New England. And that has added a huge dimension to all of our work. So with that anecdote and with all of my incredible gratitude and love for Dave Kittredge, I am very pleased to provide him with the Charles Foster Award for Exemplary Leadership in Land Conservation. So over the last couple of months, Paul Catanzaro, Dave's close colleague, and Dave have been working to develop some remarks from Dave, which Paul is now going to present.
Hank Foster was Dean of Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies when I was a student in the program. I considered Hank Foster a friend and colleague and admired Hank's interest in the regional implications of our work in the field of conservation and the environment. It is therefore goes without saying that it is an enormous honor to me to be considered for an award named for Hank Foster. It is also an honor that my work has been recognized by my fellow academics of ALPINE. In presenting this award, ALPINE has recognized the importance of land protection and the ways that land protection can enhance academic success. When I was hired more than 30 years ago by the University of Massachusetts as the state extension forester, I immediately began to develop an outreach program that was focused on helping forest landowners to make informed decisions about the management of their forests. However, it did not take long before I realized that the most significant impact on our forests was not the type of silviculture being implemented. I saw that landowners that had participated in some of my forest management workshops were converting their land. And from the driver's seat of university vans, I observed forests being converted as I drove students to the field. As a member of my town's planning board, I saw forests converted in my own community. I realized that it didn't matter how many silviculture workshops I conducted, acres of forest continued to be permanently lost to other non-forest uses. As I saw these properties being permanently converted to non-forest, I realized that we were not adequately preparing students with the knowledge, awareness, and tools to address this critical issue. I remember thinking to myself, Kittredge, this is not why you were hired, but it's what you need to do. I knew that I needed to incorporate land protection in each of the 3 areas of my university appointment: teaching, research, and extension. However, please remember that I was not, and I am not, an expert in land protection. I have never done a deal. In fact, everything that I have ever been taught, everything I have ever taught to my students about land protection, I had to first learn through extension activities and through listening to experts who brought to my classroom their real-world experience in land protection. I learned so much from our local land protection community, including the trustees of reservations, Mass Audubon, New England Forestry Foundation, Landvest, East Quabbin Land Trust, Mount Grace Land Conservation Trust, Franklin Land Trust, Greater Worcester Land Trust, Kestrel Land Trust, and private landowners. For this reason, I am hugely indebted to these friends and colleagues who helped me through this learning process, including Keith Ross, Cynthia Henshaw, Chris Pryor, Whit Beals, Tom Lutzenheiser, Bob Wilbur, Rich Hubbard, Emily Boss, Chris Peterson, Lee Youngblood, Sarah Wells, Sally Nazer, Andrew Bentley, Christian DeBoer, Jennifer Fish, Brandon Kibbe, Susan and Ben Feldman, Tony and Ann Borton, and many more. It was only with the help of these newly established conservation relationships that I was able to incorporate land protection into teaching, research, and extension, and this step allowed me to benefit from the following synergy. The research that I conducted informed my extension activities. My extension work put me into contact with those on the front lines of land protection and gave me a rich source of experts to speak to my classes. It also helped to inform my research by giving me insight into important questions to investigate. Research, extension, teaching, each component building on the other. I found greater and greater potential all along the way for incorporating land protection into academia. In the Wildlands and Woodlands effort, I also found like-minded colleagues that realized the potential for incorporating land protection into academia. I would like to thank David Foster, Mary Ann Jorgensen, Jim Levitt, and others for launching the ALPINE effort. ALPINE does an excellent job of shining a light on the critical importance of land protection. ALPINE also helps to harness the tremendous talent found in the academic environment. ALPINE has the ability to move the needle and significantly increase the pace of land conservation in New England. Land protection literacy is so very important today, and that is what is so timely about ALPINE. ALPINE encourages students to learn about land protection and helps to facilitate connections with the land protection community, allowing students to gain real-world experience about protecting land. Most of us in this room agree that colleges and universities have so much to offer the land protection community, including expertise, alumni networks, and large land holdings. In addition, we all agree that colleges and universities can be the places where we train the next generation of land protection leaders. These institutions can and must help produce the next bright land protection experts who will develop the next big land protection innovations that can take us to the next higher levels in land protection. In order for these students to have the impact and professional success that they seek and we desire for them, they need to develop the appreciation for the consequences of land conversion. In this day and age in New England, we must train students to become land protection literate and to incorporate their land protection literacy into their chosen profession and personal lives. Today's students not only need to learn how to inventory forests or to understand silvicultural systems, but land protection literacy must also become a required cornerstone in the new foundation of required knowledge of our young conservationists. If they do not understand land protection, then their professional toolbox is incomplete. I can add the following take-home message from my experience. There is no better way to add excitement and relevancy for students in a classroom than to invite a variety of landowners and colleagues from the land protection community into the classroom as guest speakers. Their presentations always add electricity to the classroom, which in turn stimulated the students. I have witnessed this amazing process. Incorporating land protection themes into education is more than just equipping students with the tools to go and do deals. As a result of these types of classroom real-world presentations, students have become aware and equipped to have those kitchen table conversations and empowered to recognize the opportunity to talk to a family or a community about the options to protect land. It is no longer enough to have a bake sale in an effort to raise money to fund the protection of critical forests or the last dairy farm. Today, we need experts with knowledge of land protection tools and an understanding of the human dimension. In summary, although I was hired as an extension forester who would, could, should help landowners and foresters to better understand their options for stewarding their forests, I found that the greatest impact that I could have on the forests of our Commonwealth involved helping landowners to understand their options to protect their forests in perpetuity for their own benefit and for the almost immeasurable public benefits that their forest lands can continue to provide. In closing, I would like to thank my many friends on the front lines of land protection, many of whom are in the room here today, including all of the land protection specialists, keystone cooperators, foresters, and landowners. After all, land conservation is about relationships. As Aldo Leopold reminds us, the real substance of conservation lies not in the physical projects of government, but in the mental processes of citizens. To those of you on the front lines of conservation, thank you for sharing your knowledge and experience with me and my students during the last 30 years. Your generosity was important to my own development and to the education of all my students. You continue to make the critical difference. Finally, I want to thank ALPINE for this honor. Thank you, ALPINE, for being a catalyst of land protection in New England. Your success exemplifies the great potential that exists for harnessing the land protection power of colleges and universities in our region. Thank you.
David, I would like to say that if Hank Foster is watching today, he's got a huge smile on his face. Congratulations.